Hey class, Mr. Stewart here, and this is going to be your Week 2 Integrity Lecture over Chapters 2 and 3 in Introduction to Criminology. This week we're going to be talking very briefly. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on either one of these chapters because it's pretty straightforward in your text, but just want to draw your attention to a few things. Chapter 2 has to do with the nature and the extent of crime, and Chapter 3 has to do with victimization. And I don't want you to discount either one of these chapters because I said I'm not going to spend a lot of time on them. But it's very straightforward in your textbook, and I'm going to bring a couple things to your attention just so that you're doubly familiar with those things because you are going to be tested over the content of the text. And as far as my lectures go, this is where I try to maybe clear up any things and point out a couple things to you that may not have been exactly clear in the text. So, Chapter 2 has to do with the nature and the extent of crime. And I want to spend just a few minutes talking about this. And what this really is if you've had intro to criminal justice or maybe even several of the other criminal justice courses, at this point, you've probably had a chapter on crime rates. And you talked about how we get crime rates, where we get the data from, etc. And this is really what this chapter is concerned with. Now, the reason it's important to criminology is because we do a lot of studies and research in criminology on the incidence of crime. And we have to know how much crime is happening in order to try to explain it, right? I mean, that makes sense. So, we have to understand where we get the data from and what some of the potential issues or problems with that data is. So we have three primary sources of crime data. The first primary source is something called the Uniform Crime Reports. The Uniform Crime Reports is data that is gathered by every local, state, and federal law enforcement agency in the country. It doesn't matter if you're a one-man police department or you've got 10,000 officers. Every department is required to collect data and submit it to their State Bureau of Investigation, who in turn submits it on a quarterly basis to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the FBI, who is the compiling agency for all this data. And it comes out once a year. I think it's called Crime in the United States. Is the book that is promulgated based upon this crime data. And let me tell you, they have analysts that run this data every which way you can think of to give you descriptions of the type and the incidence of every crime you can imagine anywhere in the United States. It's an excellent resource for criminologists to look to see what crime is more affluent, I guess you would say, in certain parts of the country at certain times. What parts of the country have more burglaries, what parts of the country have more murders, etc. That's important to understand the nature of crime and the extent of it in a particular area, because you've got to understand what's happening before you can figure out why it's happening. You can't start. You can't put the cart in front of the horse here. You got to understand. Okay, how much crime is happening? What type of crime is happening? And then I can try to figure out why that crime is emerging, which is what criminologists do. So, understand that the UCR is based on reported crimes to the police. Now, at the outset, that's a problem because not every crime that happens is reported to the police. In fact, only about half of all nonviolent crimes are even reported to the police. So, let's say if you got a particular burglary raid in a particular area of the United States, you can pretty well figure that the UCR statistic on that is very low. Now, we do a pretty good job of detecting murders and a lot of violent crimes, but it's that nonviolent crime that we really just, people don't report it. I mean, some of you may have been the victim of a crime that you just didn't think was worth reporting to the police. Maybe you didn't think there was going to be anything that could be done about it, or you didn't have any trust in the police to do anything about it, or or whatnot. But it's important to understand that just not everybody reports every crime. I mean, a lot of sex crimes are not reported. You know, if you've been the victim of sexual abuse, sexual assault, rape, whatever, a lot of times that's not reported because you don't want to have to go through the investigation because it's painful, emotionally painful and draining. So just understand, the Uniform Crime Reports have an inherent problem called underreporting. And that's because we only get about half or a little bit more of all the crimes that happen reported to the police. So we have to go further and get data from other sources. We also get data from something called the NCVS, or the National Crime Victimization Survey. This is typically either done by mail or telephone on an annual basis. People call and say, hey, you've been the victim of a crime this year. If you say yes, they say what, and whatever you say, they write it down, or whatever you write down, they report. So there's also a problem with the National Crime Victimization Survey, and the fact is that over-reporting is an issue. I don't know about you guys, but I don't like telemarketers, and I like to mess with them. You know, I'll feed them a line of bovine scatology that is second to none, and because of that, we see the same thing happen in mail surveys and telephone surveys in regard to the National Crime Victimization Survey. You know, they might call and say, hey, you've been a victim of a crime this year, and you say yes, and they say, what was it? Just, I was a victim of murder. You know what? That makes no sense, because you wouldn't be here if you were been the victim of murder. But they write it down. There's also a problem with knowing the definition of crime. I don't know how many times I've been to a burglary and the people, were saying, I got robbed. You got robbed? Tell me what the guy looked like. Well, I don't know. It was done before I got home. That you didn't get robbed. You got burglarized. There's a difference. Burglary is a property crime. Robbery is a violent crime. So it's a different classification. So we have over-reporting and misreporting in the National Crime Victimization Survey. Now, unfortunately, the UCR and the NCVS, because one's underreported, one's overreported, they don't just balance each other out. It's so far skewed, you can't just take an average of those two. You also have to use a third source of crime data, and that's called self-reports. And we get that when we do make an arrest, and we do solve a case, and we set that person down, that suspect down, and we are interviewing or interrogating them, and they tell us, well, yeah, I did that crime, but I also did this one, this one, this one, this one, and this one. And so that allows you to close more cases. It also gives you the ability to get to some of those figures of crime that either may not have ever even been reported, or you had no leads and you could not solve. You didn't really know what it was at the time. So when the criminals self-report that they've committed more crimes, that's good stuff. And if you take all three of those together, the Uniform Crime Reports, which underreporting is an issue, the National Crime Victimization Survey, which overreporting is an issue, match them together with self-reports, we get a pretty good idea of what the nature and the extent of crime is here in the United States. It's not perfect. It's not 100% accurate. We will never have a way to get that 100% accuracy, or at least not with current technology. But it gives us a pretty good idea of the crime picture, if you will, here in the United States. When we know the crime picture, we see trends emerge. You know, some years we see drug offenses go up. Some years we see property crimes go up. Some years we see violent crimes go up. Typically what we see when the economy is bad, there's a lot of property crime. There's a lot of stealing. When the economy is good, maybe you see more sex crimes, more drug crimes, because people have a lot more disposable income. So it's important to understand what the crime trends are probably going to be based upon the crime rates, along with the the current conditions in the country, as far as economics goes, as far as politics go, etc. So just to understand, we can get a lot of information from crime data to help us figure out trends and causes of crime, such as and so forth. All right. That, in a nutshell, is chapter 2. Now I'm going to go into chapter 3 here for just a minute and talk about victimization. I want you guys to understand that we used to look at victimization as if you were a victim of a crime, you were 100% a victim of a crime. That has since changed in recent years. We now look at victimization as, what did the victim do to precipitate this? Not necessarily cause it, but did the victim put themselves in a position that made them more vulnerable to an attack? Did they say something or do something that provoked the attack? What did they do? What responsibility does the victim have? Now, I don't mean to say that we're blaming the victim here. That's not what I'm talking about. But we have a new, view on victimization that really starts assigning liability. And we don't penalize the victim if we find that they are liable for their own victimization in some shape, form, or fashion. But we use it to probably punish a lesser amount the offender. If the offender's not 100% liable for their actions, then we won't give them quite as strict a punishment as if they were. There was a case several years ago out in Nebraska of this young lady who was wanted to live as a guy. She wanted to be a guy. She liked girls. Her name was Tina Brand. I think Hilary Swank starred in a movie about it was called the Tina Brand Story or something. It might have been on Lifetime. If you get a chance to watch it, it's probably on Netflix or Amazon. But she was living as a guy, purporting herself to be a guy. People thought she was a guy. And she got to hanging out with some pretty bad people. And some of these guys were ex-convicts, and they found out that she was actually a girl and that she had lied to them. They took it personal. Well, the first thing they did was they raped her repeatedly. She survived the rape. She prosecuted them for the rape, and there were some things happening in court, and I'm not exactly sure that I can't remember if they were convicted or not, or if they were. They got a very light sentence. Well, they ended up killing her, and at the murder trial of the guys that killed her, the judge found her 1% responsible for her death, and the two guys 99% responsible for her death, which meant basically they did not get the death penalty because there was some shared liability because she put herself in a position. She did some things. She lied. She was purporting herself to be something she wasn't, and because of that, the judge found that she had some fault in her own demise. And that's just kind of the nature of crime when it relates to victimization these days. And there's a lot of information in this chapter on victimization. Make sure you read this chapter because it really does talk about the kind of the connection between victimization and the crime rates, and the connection between this whole idea of shared liability. It also talks about the people that are likely to be victims, and I'm not going to rehash that because it's right in your textbook. You can read that. If you have questions about it, feel free to let me know, and I'll be happy to answer those questions. But there's some ages of people who are much more likely to be victimized than others. There's certain genders who are much more likely to be victimized. Certain people will be set themselves up to be repeat victims. We've seen that with domestic violence victims in many cases. Is they do a pretty bad job, especially the females. They'll pick a bad guy. They'll get abused, and they'll get out of that relationship. and for some reason or another they're drawn back to that same guy. It's almost like they got a V on their forehead, that they attract that same type of person. They end up getting victimized again. I'm not saying that they, they're not victims. Yes, they're victims, but they're playing a part in their victimization. They're not trying to pull themselves out of whatever the issue is that's causing them to attract these bad people into their lives. So, I don't want to step on any toes there, but that's just something that we've seen. That's just an example of the change that we've seen in this whole idea of victimization over the last several years. Is that people need to recognize they've been victimized, figure out what causes it, and hopefully they can change, and maybe we can give them the help they need so that they're not victimized again. If you look on page 68 in your textbook, it does talk about this victim precipitation theory, and also talks about a couple other theories such as lifestyle. You lead a certain lifestyle, you're much more likely to be victimized than others. I mean, think about this: if you're a prostitute, you're very likely to be sexually assaulted. You're very likely to be raped. You're very likely to be physically assaulted. Very likely to be murdered. Because you're putting yourself in a position to interact with people who are likely to do any or all of that. Even the college lifestyle, honestly, precipitates some people to be victims. In fact, more sexual assaults occur in college dorm rooms in the back seat of cars among college students than anywhere else in the country. And we typically would call that date rape or acquaintance rape. Things go too far and they don't know how to stop it. So we see that the victims do sometimes precipitate. Maybe they allow somebody to go to a certain point and then they say no. Understand, no means no, but yet you're giving mixed signals, and this can be males and females alike. I'm not just talking about one particular group of people, but I'm talking about a demographic of people. So just understand there's some theories out there that explain that certain lifestyles cause you to be more likely to be victimized than others. If you're in certain places at certain times. The deviant place theory, be familiar with that. That maybe, if you're hanging out in a bad spot, you're likely to get victimized there. If you're standing on the street corner in the gang-infested area of Los Angeles, California, guess what? The likelihood you're going to be victimized by a drive-by shooting, pretty high. Likely you might be victimized some other way, again, pretty high. Make sure you look at the routine activities theory. This one's pretty important as far as criminology goes, and it has to do with lifestyle. It has to do with the availability of suitable targets, the lack of capable guardians, and the presence of motivated offenders. It basically sets up a perfect storm that if you're in a certain place at a certain time and you don't have anybody to protect you, you're likely to be victimized. So make sure you familiarize yourself with that routine activities theory. And then also, of course, in the last part of this chapter, read over victim service programs. We have a lot of things out there to help victims of crimes. Most courts now have a victim's advocate that really works with the victims to make sure that the victim is satisfied with the outcome of the case. The victims are compensated fairly. Victims assistance programs. If you look on page 77, it really talks about victims' rights. Be familiar with what those victims' rights are as well. And I guess in a nutshell, that's pretty much it. I just want to call your attention to certain things in those two chapters. Again, if you have questions, problems, concerns, issues, reach out to me. I will tell you that I'm still working on trying to figure out how to get the videos posted in the class. I tried to upload them. When I uploaded them, they still wouldn't play because it didn't have a particular type of video player. So we may not get the videos that are on the PowerPoints. It's no biggie, guys. You can find much of the same stuff out on YouTube. So it's no biggie if you can't see those video clips. In fact, the YouTube's probably going to be better quality anyway. most of the time. All right, reach out if you need help, and I'll see you in integrity class next week. Bye-bye.